So I'm Rupert Reed, I'll be chairing the afternoon session. We've got an hour's session now after lunch, and then there'll be a break. And we've got Simon Fairley and Helen Bachowska to talk basically about how the kind of thing we're talking about here today impacts in the rural context, which after all, as was pointed out earlier, is of course the great majority of the land area of our country. Sometimes a simple fact we sometimes forget. It's a great pleasure to introduce first then to speak Simon Fairley. Simon may be known to some of you for his key role in the wonderful periodical publication The Land. Those of you who don't know it, highly recommended. He may also be known to some of you as the author of a fascinating little study, surprising that so few people have done such studies, of whether it's possible for Britain to be self-sufficient in food. A scandalous situation in my opinion, and obviously absurdity that we are miles from being self-sufficient in food at the kind of time in history that we're now in, with all the hazards attendant upon that time that Brian outlined earlier for us. Simon's conclusion basically was that, well, yes, it is possible, although it will not be at all easy, and some of the things that would need to change would be, to use a phrase quoted earlier, a little bit eye-watering. Anyway, that's enough from me. It's a great pleasure, as I say, to hear from Simon on this crucial topic.
Okay, my name's Simon Fairley. I'm a smallholder, and I edit The Land magazine, which is, as you see, very well thumbed. I'm not a scientist, so I'm always a slight trepidation of being found wrong by scientists, but it hasn't happened yet. Earlier in one of the presentations we saw that Sweden was the best performing in terms of reducing its emissions, and down at the bottom, along with Poland and various other coal producers, was Ireland. Now, I didn't explain why. Possibly one reason was because they had peat in their fire stations. I don't know whether that's accounted for or not. But another reason certainly is that they have an awful lot of beef. And that basically, if you're talking about climate change and carbon emissions in the countryside, the main thing you're talking about is livestock. Because whatever your position, livestock have, being higher in the food chain, have a much higher impact upon virtually everything than most forms of agriculture. The FAO says that livestock are responsible for 14.5% of human greenhouse gas emissions. It used to be 18%, they reduced it. It's now 14.5%. Of that, 80% comes from ruminants, cows, sheep, goats. Of that 80%, 50% of that is from methane. Nearly half of it is from methane. Right? Now, when people make calculations about the emissions from various countries, they are combining a number of different gases, which include CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and so forth. And they do so through a metric called the CO2 equivalent. And this equivalent has all the pretensions of being a scientific fact. It's not. It's basically an assessment. One might even call it a political opinion. Thus it is that when I first started getting interested in all this stuff, in about 2000 I think it was, methane emissions, 1 gram of methane was reckoned to be 20 times as powerful as 1 gram of carbon dioxide. It then went up to 23. It then went up to 25. The IPCC now says it's 28. And for some inscrutable reason that I don't explain, the FAO says it is 34 times. And that's what this 14.5% relies on. Now, I'm going to look, this graph here explains, I hope, to some people. This graph was performed by Tara Garnett for a recent publication called Grazed and Confused. And I think it illustrates better than ever the very complex difference between carbon dioxide emissions and methane emissions. It certainly helped me understand everything. Now, if you look at the top here, each of these lines, well in both of them, represents stable emissions, the same emission every year over 100 years. They're both over 100 years. It's the same amount of emissions every year, each line. And on this axis, gives you the amount of global warming, as each one is layered on the next one. So you see that with carbon dioxide, because it lasts a very long time in the atmosphere, not much of it disappears, and every year, as you keep on piling more and more on at the same rate, the slope of increase goes inexorably upwards, right? Now, with methane, it's not at all the same thing, because methane disappears, most of it disappears within 30 years. And so, as you keep piling it on at the same rate, it gradually gets to the point that it stabilises, or very closely stabilises. Now, what does this mean in terms of comparing the two? Well, if you imagine that you're trying to get to a target in, say, 30 years' time of a certain amount of global warming, say 2% above historic levels, or 3 or 1.5, doesn't matter which, right? If you carry on producing the same amount of carbon dioxide, you're just piling it on and on and on. And the only way to actually achieve any reasonable target is to drastically reduce the amount of carbon you're emitting. And even then, it doesn't really make that much difference. So if you imagine we're now about there in the say we're at year 70, and we stop by 30 years' time, in 2050, there's still almost the same amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Whereas here, if we're here on the methane chart, and we stop producing it altogether, it shoots down to there. Far less. The second thing that comes from this graph is that if we reduce the amount of methane, say from this point here, and we stop it, reduce it, that makes a difference to what's happening now, but it actually makes very little difference to what's happening in 30 years' time, which means that it's the argument saying that we are able to delay our reductions of carbon dioxide by reducing methane are basically bogus. This is what Alan Miles of the Environmental Change Institute at Oxford has to say. But I quote him because I'm not a scientist, you see, so I have to quote a scientist on this. And he says, "It is quite wrong to suggest that bringing forward methane and similar emissions, short life emissions, reductions, can buy time to procrastinate over CO2. Quite the reverse. Early measures in this respect only have an impact on peak warming if ambitious CO2 mitigation measures are already underway. Unless CO2 emissions are being reduced at the same time, it makes almost no difference to peak warming whether methane emissions are reduced now or reduced at some later date." And from this it follows that the way emissions are calculated at the moment, we could cut out, say, carbon emissions, methane emissions from beef, and it would look as though we drastically reduced the amount of emissions we were making, but actually that would have very little effect in 30 years' time. And well, even more dangerous is if we get implemented some sort of system where methane reductions, because they're deemed to be equivalent in some way to CO2, therefore can offset reductions, and countries can say, oh, well, it doesn't matter if we burn more carbon, more fossil fuels, because we've drastically got rid of our livestock. And again, Miles Allen says, Such large-scale offsetting, were it to occur, would wipe out the impact of methane reductions in the short term, while in the long term it will result in substantially more warming because of additional CO2. The third thing to understand from this graph is that first of all, methane, if you're emitting the same amount of methane each year, then it's more or less the same amount in the atmosphere. It's not increasing like carbon dioxide does. That means that a quite small reduction in methane emissions will immediately start to reduce the amount of global warming caused by methane, which is not the case with fossil fuels. Basically, the two gases cannot be are not equivalent. There's no way of equivalent to making an equivalence between them, and to do so involves perversions, which I think are having an effect upon the way we look at farming and at landscape and so forth. So, for example, the Oxford Institute for Environmental Change reckons that we need just a 6% reduction in methane emissions globally, and that would reduce the amount of global warming attributable to methane. You can't do that with fossil fuels. The IPCC says, it's much more cautious, it says less than 30%, right? So, first of all, you don't need to remove that many cows to get a decent amount of reduction. The next thing I want to add to this is, that a lot of people don't realise, is that the amount of methane emissions from fossil fuel are slightly more than the amount of methane emissions from livestock. Well, they're about the same, it depends on your measurement. What this means in turn is that, I mean, sure, if you got rid of all the beef, there would be a pretty quick reduction in emissions, even if it wouldn't have much effect in 30 years' time, unless you kept it up. Similarly, if we got rid of all fossil fuels, and in order to meet our Paris agreements, we're supposed to get rid of 80% of fossil fuels, then that in itself would get rid of the same amount of methane as you would get rid of by getting rid of animals. And we have to do that anyway. So this is coming closer to the thrust of what I'm saying, which is that by focusing on livestock, which a lot of people increasingly are doing, and I seem to remember with 13% of people in one of the graphs said that that was their main way of addressing climate change in their personal lives, was by reducing livestock. By focusing emissions reductions on livestock, we are in fact putting the cart before the horse. Because if we focus on fossil fuels, then livestock, first of all, we will solve the methane problem insofar as methane, the amount of global warming caused by methane will reduce considerably. And secondly, if we get rid of fossil fuels or reduce to 80%, then that will in itself reduce the amount of livestock that we have. We're not going to be able to maintain so many livestock if we don't have fossil fuels. And there are two main reasons why. The first is that without fossil fuels, artificial fertilisers will become much more expensive. And if they're more expensive, then it will be harder to grow crops. And if we produce fewer crops, then what crops are we going to not produce? It's the ones that are fed to animals really inefficiently. It's animal feed we'll get rid of. The fact that we give animal feed to animals at the moment is a wonderful result of, it gives us elasticity in our food production systems. That's what animals are for, or one of the things they're for, is to give a bit of elasticity so that in a bad year you can feed more animal feed, or you can slaughter some of the animals and reduce animal feed consumption. So that's one way in which, when we reduce fossil fuels, I say when, not if, livestock will inevitably reduce it itself. The second reason is that there will be increased competition for land. There already is competition for land between a number of actors, but once fossil fuels go down, there will be increased pressure and increased financial incentives for using land for biomass energy of various kinds. And that is going to outcompete grazing to the point where grazing actually is economically, it's so rare that it becomes as economically viable as biomass. When that happens, who knows? But it certainly will address its balance. One of the things that might be in favour of grazing is that it actually brings in some of the fertility, and that's what was one of the original reasons for having livestock, was to harness the fertility from the hinterland, from the saltus, from the biomass, from the outer biomass, and bring it in for arable cultivation. And if we have far fewer artificial fertilisers, then there's going to be more need for that. So that need is going to be balanced against the need to grow coppice wood or miscanthus or various other forms of biomass. And it will inevitably also result in a reduction in livestock production. Now, how much time have I got left?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. Good. If I had 10 minutes, I might go into a couple of the forms of biomass production that are being proposed. One of which is in the Centre for Alternative Technologies Zero Carbon Britain, where they propose quite a bit of miscanthus and secondary generation biomass crops. Another is Dale Vince of Ecotricity, who has a scheme for converting higher quality grassland, the sort of thing that dairy cows eat, into electricity as well. I'm at the moment working on some costings for that, and as far as I can see, you get a better deal with the cows than you do with the... you can feed about 12 people per hectare all their food from the grass on a hectare, or you can heat about the dwellings of about 4.5% if you put it into an AD. And the reason for that is because keeping food in the food chain is nearly always more valuable than burning it. But I'm not totally against what it's doing, and it's very interesting what it's doing, and there's probably a place for all these things. The one other competing use of land, main competing use of land, I'm not talking about horses and golf and things like that. The other main use is biodiversity, and that's increasingly coming to the fore. And rewilding has suddenly become a popular concept, not least thanks to George Monbiot. In my view, that is actually one of the few, in fact it's the only reasonably good argument for veganism, is that the land for grazing could be used for something else. I don't agree with it, but it is an argument that carries some weight, unlike quite a lot of arguments, including the global warming one, I think. I could also go on about nitrous oxide, but I haven't got any time for that. I could say how much talk about the fossil fuel generated by industrial agriculture, but I haven't got time for that. What we have got time for is Helen, who's now going to talk about diversity, which of course, as I've mentioned, is one of the other main possible uses of the land we have around us. Okay, thank you. I have got some copies of the Land magazine, which include this graph in it.
Hiya, thank you very much. Just a very quick introduction. So I work as a part-time ecologist. I'm also a common rights holder, and this isn't a selfie, by the way. This is one of the sheep that I run on our common land for 6 months of the year. The work that I do as an ecologist is working with landowners to bring land into a more biodiverse state. So I have a huge amount of sympathy being a common right holder and doing this work, for the amount of red tape that farmers have to deal with, and that's something we can talk about another time. So anyway, that's one of my Hebridean sheep. This is a turtle dove, and I put a turtle dove up because I think they are such a good symbol of where we are with biodiversity in this country at the minute, and it brings out a lot of different situations. This is Europe's only migratory dove, and I want you to hang on to that fact because it's going to be important later. They have the most fantastic call. The writer Roger Deakin referred to it as the bass note of the countryside, which I think really, really sums up the noise that they make. It's a lovely purr, like a happy cat.
Can you imitate it for us?
No, I can't, sorry. We could find one on Google later, maybe. They've had a 90% decline over the last couple of decades in the UK. And there's all sorts of reasons why we might say that's happened. We might say that some of it is because a lot of them get shot on their migratory route through Italy and Malta. That's got a lot of headlines. The real reason they're declining is a lack of habitat and a lack of food in the UK. That is why they're declining. This is a bird of traditional farmland. Most of our declining species are creatures of traditional farmed landscapes. They are not the species of the big wild places. We eradicated most of those in this country quite successfully. The ones we've got left are the ones that rely on agricultural landscapes. And one of the things that's coming out at the minute with turtle doves is that the poor habitats we have left that provide very little in the way of shelter for them mean they're more exposed to predation, so they get eaten off by magpies and crows and everything else. And also, we have a paucity of seed available. These are seed-feeding creatures. And what happens is they tend to go and eat wheat. And it's like us existing on a diet of chips. You know, you can live on them, but you're not very healthy. And this is what's happening to them. Their health is declining because their seed source is really, really poor. Right, I just put this in just to remind ourselves about traditional farmed landscapes. And, you know, as I was saying, this is where most of our species evolved to live. I'm not advocating a return to this kind of agriculture wholesale. There are hardy folk out there that want to plough with horses. Simon and I have both done it ourselves. It's hard work. But I want you to hold in mind that those traditional landscapes did hold a lot of opportunities for wildlife, and not to completely lose sight of that. Talked about species. Another depressing statistic. My real love in life is wildflower meadows. I think they're absolutely fantastic. They are our rainforests. We've had a 90% decline since the end of the Second World War, which is catastrophic, really, in terms of the things that live there. And the key word I want you to notice here is the word destroyed. These were not lost. They've not just vanished into mid-air. They have been destroyed by us as taxpayers through subsidies to landowners. That's a link we have to make. That is what has happened. Simon has said how modern agriculture is enormously dependent on fossil fuels. It's completely dependent on oil in this country, completely, for everything that it does. And this has led us to these huge economies of scale where, you know, one farm will only employ one person and a few contractors at certain points of the year, using extremely large pieces of machinery. This is my last depressing statistic, I promise you. I put the hedgehog in because it's another one that has got a lot of press, particularly recently. And again, you know, you get these complicated reasons for its decline coming out. And the popular one is, it's due to the rise in badgers, because we all know that badgers eat hedgehogs. There's a lot more badgers in the countryside. That must be why we've got fewer hedgehogs. 2 weeks ago, there was a report by the People's Trust for Endangered Species that says actually what has happened is that the dwindling amount of habitat available for both hedgehogs and badgers means they're being forced into smaller and smaller spaces together. The badgers are at stress level, so although there's more badgers, they're more stressed because they're in a smaller space, so they're eating hedgehogs, which is not actually their preferred food. They'd rather eat earthworms. And so, you know, the picture coming out is actually quite complicated here. So we haven't got a pointer. We've got a pointer? No, I'll do it by hand. It's all right. So I put this on because I just think it's a lovely illustration of what I'm talking about. This is actually where I live. This is the common land that I have common rights on. And it's an island in an arable sea. The 1960, I have a copy of the 1960 land use map for this area. These fields here which actually are really small by today's standards. This one was 3 separate fields. You can probably just about make out remnants of the ditch system. So when I was a child in the late 70s, that field was 3 fields. Here was 6 fields, every one of which was in permanent pasture with hedges. That's now 1 field. This farm, they're lovely people, these farmers, my neighbours, they are lovely people. In the 1960s, they were told by their bank and by their agronomist that what they had to do was produce pigs, and do nothing but produce pigs. So every acre, a small family farm, around about 100 acres, it's not a big farm in today's standards. Every single acre of that farm goes to grow wheat and barley to feed pigs that live in those barns and never see the light of day. That's considered, a good agricultural business model. They don't make any money. They're losing money hand out of fist. They all have to do extra jobs to keep the farm going. It's a crazy, broken situation. And a situation where 100 acres doesn't quite grow enough food to feed a handful of pigs that live in a barn. Go figure the sense of that as an economic business model. I really don't understand it. Anyway, I put this on because one of the things it shows, and this is where I'm going to start talking about climate change, is that nature does not live in a box. Nature doesn't live in this little box here. This is a great place. We've got great crested newts in the ponds, we've got waterfowls, we've got turtle doves that breed there, we've got red kites that come over these days, we've got loads of hedgehogs out the door with the things. But they cannot spread across the countryside. How do they get down here to the ancient woodland? How do they get to the other common that's here and the other one that's up here? And this is where I think often wildlife and conservation bodies and environmental bodies are perhaps not joining the dots at the minute, because climate change is going to add a whole level of stress to these species that live in these places. And in order to survive into the future, those species are going to have to be able to move, and they're going to have to be more genetically diverse so they can adapt better. Because these populations that are this isolated, they're not genetically sustainable either. And, smaller areas, you get smaller species and you get fewer species. So it's putting nature in a box doesn't work. And adding the pressure of climate change is going to mean even more. So somehow, as we look to the future and we look to future models of farming, I want to say, let's make sure that we join the dots here. And let's make sure that we put this permeable landscape, we call it, back into the frame as well. Right, another few minutes yet. I put this in because I just think this is a very, very sort of symbolic picture, really, of this is where I feel biodiversity ends up a lot of the time these days, is sort of on the roadside nature reserve between the arable field and the road, and that's about it, really. This here, this sort of tatty yellow-looking thing, is a rare plant that really only survives on road verges now in South Norfolk. That's pretty much where it's left, and it would have survived in hay meadows, kind of all over the region, really. So where do we go from here? Let's talk about the future and the hope that we might have, because it is important that we do that. Some of you might have already seen the Manifesto for Wildlife. Some of you will have been aware last weekend of the Walk for Wildlife in London that Chris Packham led. And if you get a chance to read it, it is a really good document. It really goes through a whole lot of things that we can do and we can think about. The driver for this, and I think this is probably something that hasn't sort of percolated out yet, the driver for this is that as part of the EU withdrawal bill, we as in the UK, had to agree to bring over a lot of the environmental legislation into our own legislation, and also to create an independent body to look at overseeing our environmental rules in the way that the European Union would have done for us in the past, and that's a big part of this. From what I can work out from the Environment Bill that's coming forward, there's no mention of climate change in it because the government consider that's dealt with in another bill. And again, that joined up thinking just isn't happening, as we've said so much today already. Where this does mention agriculture, it's very critical of the NFU and the CLA, so the farmers' representative bodies, in seeing them as a big obstacle, more so than individual farmers, which I think is probably quite apt. But this document does put climate change as a sort of central pillar to what we need to consider when we look at wildlife legislation in the future. One of the things it talks about is the agri-environment schemes, so the schemes that fund farmers to do positive things for wildlife. My current thinking is that what the Tory government has done to those pieces of support for farmers are absolutely dreadful, in that what they're doing is concentrating the money more and more into bigger landowners, and support for smaller landowners, for smallholders like Simon, and for smaller farms isn't really there, and they're the people who I think are going to be more innovative in the future in terms of adapting what we grow and how we go forward in the face of a changing climate. This is the NEP rewilding project. So rewilding is very, very popular at the moment, and it's really come up the agenda over the last 20 years as a potential way of creating new land for wildlife. And this is NEP in Sussex, where the landowner has taken about 3,500 acres of land out of production and just put out some large grazing animals and seen how it will go back to some kind of wild land. As an ecologist, I find it absolutely fascinating to watch what happens as this land actually recovers itself and starts to become more biodiverse. However, it is still in a box. It's not actually creating a network out into the wider countryside, as I said, for species to move around. It's still quite on that old-fashioned nature reserve model, so it has some limitations there. But it's a really nice place to visit, I will say that. I thought I'd talk, this is somebody's forest garden. Isn't that a nice forest garden? One of the ways that I suspect we will look at adapting is things like agroforestry and organic agriculture. And I kind of apologise a bit for lumping them all together, but what I want to draw attention to is the alternatives to the mainstream fossil fuel heavy agriculture. These systems, where it's been studied, are immeasurably better for biodiversity. But I do still think we mustn't lose sight of the stuff that I've already talked about and the evidence-based approach, and the fact that this needs to be more than a one-farm approach. It needs to be a strategic approach where we're looking at links across the wider countryside. And if you come back, or I said at the beginning, remember that the turtle dove is Europe's only migratory dove. It's going to have to find new places to migrate to overwinter as southern Spain and North Africa become desert. So, putting that habitat in place on a European scale and putting those corridors in place for it to move along are key to those kind of approaches. Right, this is my last slide, so I'm going to stop in a minute. The guy in the background there is a farmer called Ed Cross, who some of you might know, farms up in northwest Norfolk. This is Norfolk's Chalk Downs, so looks a bit like sort of bits of Wiltshire rather than Norfolk. Ed is a small family farmer. He's a tenant farmer, so he's not a huge estate. He's just a very ordinary farmer. And Ed is one of my farming heroes. He really is. So he's become an expert in creating new grassland on the Chalk Downs. So on land that's very, very poor agriculturally, it doesn't really produce a lot in crops. But he's now being able to sort of turn it back to permanent grassland in a way that's really quite exciting from a biodiversity point of view. But I also put this slide up because I reckoned when I put it up, a lot of you would go, oh, isn't that nice? Doesn't that look like a nice place to be? And that's kind of where I want to end, really, because I think we need to value these spaces. And I find it very hard, I'm a romantic soul at heart. I find it really hard to kind of put a monetary value on that feeling of space and that enjoyment of wildlife. And we know that there's a value on pollinators that will live on all these wildflowers and go out and pollinate our crops for us. We know that there's a financial value on those things. But that value of just having these spaces to enjoy is also really important, and we need to have that as part of what we do as well. Right, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. Well, I think we've had a couple of super talks there. Just before I throw it open, we've got plenty of time for questions. A little technical question to Simon. Simon, the figures you gave for methane and CO2, do they take into account the fact that methane decays into CO2?
Well, yes, yeah. They are based on some equivalence, knowing that it decays into CO2. And actually, the figures the IPCC gives, in fact, is 28 times. Methane is 28 times as strong as carbon dioxide, but fossil fuel methane is 30 times as strong because it's actually drawn out of the crust of the earth rather than being simply recycled around the biosphere, which is what livestock methane is.
Okay.
But I mean, what's also peculiar is the way in which the amount has almost doubled from 20 to 34 times in a matter of about 15 years, which leads, I'm not a scientist, I don't know, but it all looks very suspect.
I'm just a bit confused because my understanding was that the reason the methane drops off so much is because it stops being methane, but that it decays into CO2, so I thought it produced stuff that then kind of goes into a long flat line like the CO2 does, and that was my understanding of what Gavin Schmidt's argued recently about this, suggesting that we can underestimate the effect of methane because we don't necessarily fully take into account the way in which so much of it becomes CO2.
Well, yes, but it decays into CO2 that was there already. The CO2 that's ingested by beef is CO2 that was in the natural cycle, whereas the methane that is leaked out when they mine fossil fuels is new carbon dioxide, new carbon. That's why they give 30 times rather than 28 times the IPCC.
Got it. Okay, thanks. So yeah, the point is that the net effect is the one that you've shown. The gross effect would look very different. Mm-hmm. The gross effect of methane would look very, very bad. But okay, that's fine. Thank you. Let's see some hands, please. So Jen here, and then Andrew. Yeah. Yeah. If you want, we're encouraging people to stand up and shout.
Yeah. Hello. About rewilding, is it always a good idea? I'm thinking in particular of a project in Holland, which seemed to have disastrous results. I just wondered if you knew about that. What would you like to say about that?
Yeah, so the project you're talking about, Jen, is Untitled, which is was the last of the drained polders in the Netherlands, and there was a referendum to turn it back into a wild area. And the idea was to sort of put out a number of large grazing herbivores and test the theory that they are absolutely key to the maintenance of habitats. Unfortunately, the thing that they missed out on is the role of the predator. And, you know, if you're going to put out large herbivores, they will have a tendency to breed and breed and breed and then eat everything. Doesn't always happen. There is a herd of wild cattle in Northumberland that actually regulate their own population by regulating breeding and carrying out very proactive infanticide if necessary. And they're one of the rarest species on the planet. But Untitled, they were putting out effectively sort of derivatives of domesticated species that couldn't do that. And you know, you have a choice. So at NEP, what happens is they cull the large herbivores. So they cull the deer, they cull the pigs, they cull the cattle, and they eat them. And so they are the people are the predator. You know, in the wild you had to have wolves to do that, and unfortunately what happened at Untitled, and you'd have thought was downright predictable, which is these things exploited all the grazing resources and then started starving to death. And it was, you know, no animal should be kept in captivity, however big its cage, in that condition, frankly.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah. Grab the thing as well. Yeah. Thank you for very interesting talks. I'm afraid I'm going to have to be awkward again, actually, and come back on what you said, Simon, from a sort of scientific point of view, really. I take your point that methane has a much shorter half-life than CO2, and that's basically what your graphs were showing in a scientific point of view. But there is a really, really big problem with industrial agriculture and climate change and emissions. And actually a wider environmental issue. I'll come back to the emissions in a minute, but industrial agriculture, if you look at it, I mean, you've got all sorts of aspects, like the effect it's having on biodiversity, the effect it's having on biodiversity, the effect of the feed, for example, for cattle, in South America, the massive soya monocultures that's destroying wildlife, going into the Amazon and so on. You've got pollution of water before you even get to the climate issue with it. But when you look at the climate issue, you've got both methane, you've also got nitrous oxide, and I think that's part of that 50%, other 50% you were talking about. But you were talking about half-life and the effect tailing off. The situation we're in is we've got to massively reduce emissions now. So the important thing is actually not the tailing off, but where we are on that graph. Now, the actual effect, and what scientists call it, is radiative forcing. The radiative forcing from the methane, which is actually produced in the atmosphere now. Now, we're actually seeing methane going up, and the scientists at the moment don't actually understand why methane is going up. It could be because we're getting methane coming out of the Arctic burping effect, and that is very, very serious worry for everybody. We don't know whether that's going to cut in as a feedback loop. And this isn't to do with agriculture, it's to do with the methane cleft rates and so on at the bottom of the ocean. But methane is a serious problem, and it is going up. And it's the actual intensity of the methane in the atmosphere today and increasing, which is the issue. Now, coming back to agriculture, I don't know if you saw the grain report, but the grain report used the CO2 equivalents, which you were talking about, but I actually think it used them in a correct way, and it said that if industrial agriculture carries on as it is from now to 2050, then at 2050 the CO2 equivalents of industrial agriculture will be 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalents. Now, when we had Brian's graph right at the beginning this morning, he was showing 40 gigatons today, more or less, as the global carbon footprint. So that's a quarter of the current global carbon footprint, and it won't have disappeared. That's what they're saying it's going to be in 2050. And you're talking about if we reduce all carbon emissions from transport, you reduce all carbon emissions from industry, you would still get left with 10 gigatons of equivalents of radiative forcing in the atmosphere from industrial agriculture. It's very similar to the aviation issue about, if you cut everything else, aviation will still land up having a big carbon footprint. The same is true of industrial agriculture. So I have to say to you, actually, I think we do all need to become vegan, because industrial agriculture is where most people are getting their meat from. And I think, what small-scale farms and so on do is great, but it's not touching the tip of the iceberg, and there's a very, very big iceberg there in carbon emissions.
Yes, well, first of all, I completely agree with you about half of what you said. Industrial agriculture causes a lot of problems. I'm not arguing for industrial agriculture at all. What is in fact happening is that because of this concentration on methane and what I consider to be an exaggeration of methane, or at least an abuse of the equivalents, is that the people who are in favour of sustainable intensification are arguing in favour of industrial agriculture. Their argument is that ruminants are the problem, and that what we want is more factory farming and more efficient animals. That means more factory farming, more growing grains to feed to animals in factories and so forth, which is I'm totally opposed to. And it's a result. What you have by this focusing on ruminants is you have a sort of unholy alliance between vegans and industrial farmers, saying, right, we have to produce everything with crops, ignore the grassland, ignore ruminants, and eat what's basically junk food, and that's it's very, very worrying. I mean, I could go on. I could talk about nitrous oxide, because nitrous oxide is emitted by livestock and by crops. In fact, nitrous oxide is a necessary byproduct of fertilisation. And it's true that livestock probably are a bit more inefficient than some crops, but and I'm totally in favour of reducing livestock. They have to be reduced, but not using the bogus figures that are currently being used, and that's what worries me. The best way of reducing livestock is to get rid of animal feed, which is fed to animals in confined operations, and that will release a lot of cropland, which can be used for growing human food, or it can be turned over to something else, either biomass or biodiversity or whatever. It's about half of our cropland. That can go to something else, and it will mean that we have less meat to eat. And the other advantage of that is it will actually sequestrate carbon in the soil, because the easiest and the safest and actually really the only sure way of sequestrating carbon in the soil is to convert arable to pasture or trees or something like that. So I'm with you most of the way.
Yeah, it does seem to me as though that there's actually less disagreement between the two of you than at first appeared. Well, not really, no, because we've got several more questions. It does seem to me that there's a lot less disagreement than at first appeared, because the two of you are in strong agreement that the real culprit is industrial agriculture, right? Whether it's for producing animals or producing crops. And if we can agree with that, then there'll still be some disagreement, but that'll be a lot less.
Disagreements on conflating veganism with supporting industrial agriculture. I mean, I just don't.
Yeah, so I think there was possibly a misunderstanding.
All right, that was a bit contentious.
Yeah. Great. So I saw some hands over here. Who had the hands up?
I was just going to question your equation, actually. Because actually veganism depends on unsustainable agriculture, as far if we're talking about self-sufficiency in food, because
in the UK.
You can't be a vegan in this country and only eat stuff produced here, which is best within the world. Plus we have various habitats that, through centuries of human use, unless we completely rewild them and don't use them for food production, the only food production that's going to be on them is going to be livestock, grazing marshes and the Broads, for instance.
Do you want to have a quick come back on that?
You can get a long way by growing your own food in veganism, is what I'd say. I mean, tofu comes from soya, which is probably coming from... But you get a long way by growing your own food, your own beans and things like that, as someone was saying earlier.
Yeah. Good. At the back.
Yeah, I'll just change the topic a bit. I wondered if we could just ask if you could say a bit more about these biodiversity corridors and whether you think are sort of critical to solving the problems we've got at the moment, and whether by that you mean kind of nature reserves that join up across the country, or do we need to find a way of going back to how it used to be, that you could sustain biodiversity in and around the way we lived a bit more? Is it about changing our everything?
Can I add on a little bit to that?
Yeah, go on, Peter.
Is there a plan for what would be required in terms of corridors? Is it green bridges across roads? Has someone done a plan as what's necessary? And then are there leverages?
Yeah. So I think the answer is all of those things are true. And yes, green bridges across motorways, if you must build motorways, if you must have motorways, then yes, absolutely. And yes, more what you were saying in terms of nature reserves, I think there's a number of things. So it's buffering the existing habitat, so that the picture I showed of the road verge, that's incredibly liable to suffer from atmospheric nitrogen from passing vehicles and from spray drift from the arable field on the other side. So you've got a huge amount of nutrient going into that habitat, without anything to do with how it's managed in its own right. So yes, buffering of nature reserves is absolutely key, and allowing them to perhaps expand a little bit. But also, simply putting back hedges would be a huge thing. The slide I showed about the hay meadow, it's not just the case that these things have been destroyed. This isn't an end point. All of the drivers that have led to this habitat destruction are still in place. And even though we've got membership of environmental and wildlife organisations rocketing, and even though the amount of agricultural subsidies for wildlife has gone up, we are still losing habitat despite all of those statistics. So yes, absolutely, all of those things need to be looked at. Is there a plan? Well, there are plans in different areas, and I think that's the best answer I can give. So there's been a huge amount of effort put into ecological network mapping. So it's looking at where existing habitat is, where are the crucial places to put in the buffers and the corridors between them. And that is being done from everything within neighbourhood plans at a parish and town council level to green infrastructure when you have new developments coming in. It's less being considered within farming, and that's where I think the next crucial thing lies, is to actually look at key landscapes and work out where do we put those things back in. And it needs to rely on evidence. So it needs to rely on evidence of the species that we know live there and use that landscape and how they use it. And your other question was about livelihoods?
Well, no, it was about, has anyone worked out how many miles of hedgerow we've lost and therefore could be put back in, and therefore how many jobs it would take to put them back in?
Yeah. I don't think anyone's made that leap, but there's a job for you, eh? But I do also think that there are opportunities there for, as I said when I put the slide of the horses up, most of the species that are now in critical decline are those that relied on an agricultural landscape. That landscape was evolved at a time when almost everything in it had an economic value of some description. Pollards, coppice, hedgerow, they all provided small timber at a time when we didn't have plastics. So we produce things from small local timber, and you don't move timber very far because it's heavy generally, or you try not to. So a very, very different mindset that we had even a few generations ago. So that there are opportunities there.
The model includes hedge laying at the moment, but not planting.
So there you go, planting hedges, but also the future management of the hedges. So this guy Ed here, one of the most novel things he has done on his farm is he doesn't go around with a flail and flail the bejesus out of them every year, which is what most farmers do because it's cheap. And you've got a big tractor, it's sitting there doing nothing else at that time of the year, so you may as well send your chap out to drive around and flail the hedges. It doesn't do anything for wildlife, it doesn't do anything for the health of the hedge, but the hedge hasn't got a value, so why do you care? What Ed has done is gone back to coppicing his hedges on a 10-year rotation, so they produce coppice wood, they're fantastic for birds, and they just look gorgeous, and they're great for things like hedgehogs that actually live at the base of a hedge, where you need a nice, thick, robust habitat, and it's a much better approach. So there you go. You've got hedge laying, hedge planting, hedge coppicing. You've got a lot of opportunities, and growing the trees in a nursery to start with.
Question there.
Yeah, just a very brief point. We've mentioned organics several times in passing, and just a very short story. There's some very nice biscuits out there, which are commendably organic. If you look at, they're made in the southwest and their ingredients have come from more than one country. So just because we're talking about organic food doesn't mean there's a predisposition that they're particularly good in terms of the environment. And I think if we're going to be talking about, hopefully, a more green future after Brexit, one of the things we should look at is re-establishing small holdings for 1 or 2 hectares and for people to be able to get planning permission to turn them into farms so that people can actually shop locally. Because food miles are a disgrace. And I think a lot of vegans, when you go into your supermarkets to become a vegan, please don't buy anything that comes from overseas unless you strictly have to. Because you're really just contradicting everything that veganism stands for.
There's a very interesting report that's just come out from the Sustainable Food Trust on the loss of small local abattoirs, again for supporting local supply chains, because if you haven't got that locally, it's not local.
Well, there was an interesting debate in the organic movement a few years ago about whether if it had too many food miles it shouldn't be allowed to be classed as organic at all. Simon and then Helen.
Yes, well I agree with you. I have a small micro dairy on the sort of guest house town conference centre. I feed 30 people there with milk, cheese, yoghurt and so forth, and I have a certain amount for sale outside. The food, I don't have food miles, I have food yards, about 150 of them from the milking parlour to the point of distribution. I have no packaging whatsoever. All I have is 10 litre churns and the milk is sold. and there's very little you can think of that you could do with that land, most of which is not arable, which would be more productive than what I do. And it's from a point of view of biodiversity, it's not an SSSI, but it's pretty good. There's lots of stuff there. And the problem I have is that because we're a sort of hippie hotel, increasing numbers of people coming are vegan or dairy free. So as well, although we're producing a large amount of the fat and the protein and the carbohydrates that we serve to people, these people either demand or bring in tofu, almond milk, nuts, and everything from all over the place. It's a sizable part of our budget, and it means that the poor chef has to cook 2 different dishes, And what it actually means is that we end up with a sort of lowest common denominator, which is, although we're producing quite a lot of milk and meat, very often it's not used, and instead we're using, we don't use palm oil, but we're using oil imported, sunflower oil imported from Europe or something like that. So yes, I totally agree with you.
No, I just wanted to sort of pick up what you said about local food, and one of the things that struck me quite recently about East Anglia is that we grow field after field after field of crop, and it's all shipped to the west of the country, west of the country, to feed the animals that live over on the other side of the UK. I mean, it's an utter, unless you're like my neighbour that doesn't quite grow enough food for his own pigs, the whole system is, when you start to tease it apart, is so very scarily broken, really. And I don't have much faith that Michael Gove's current agriculture and environment bill will actually do a lot to reverse those trends. And I'm speaking out of turn here from the organisation that I work with, and from a lot of people I know who are saying, oh, well, that Michael Gove, he's saying some jolly good stuff. In some ways he is, but it's a lot of tinkering at the edges. It's not addressing the fundamental flaws in the system.
Okay, we're almost at break. Final quick question.
I was going to just say, mention something about how much most people around here would probably like to grow their own food, but there's a huge problem with land ownership in this country.
Allotments, they're all empty.
Not all, but there are free allotments.
Farming land.
Yeah.
Masses and masses of the land in Norfolk, all around us, is owned by just a handful of extremely rich farmers who will be voting Conservative in order to keep their land. And if young people around here want a job on a local farm, it's really hard to come by, because there are so few people who working the farms. Anyway, I just...
Quick answer, Simon.
Yeah, I quite agree with you.
Do you happen to own your own land, perhaps?
No, I don't. I rent it from the hippie hotel. Renting is much cheaper than buying at the moment. But of course it doesn't normally have the security. It's a huge problem for people if it's all estates. Where I am, it's not estates. If you want to, the people who are trying to address this most directly are the Land Workers Alliance. And so if you are a person who either wants, but it's actually a union, so if you're a person who is either farming under those sort of difficult conditions or wants to, or in any way wants to champion the right of small farmers, join the Land Workers Alliance.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Helen.